The Gospel according to Mark, chapter 6, verses 45 to 56. And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship, and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling in rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. And when they had passed over, they came unto the land of Gennesaret, and drew to the shore. And when they were come out of the ship, straightway they knew him, and ran through that whole region round about, and began to carry about in beds those that were sick, where they heard he was. And whithersoever he entered, into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets, and besought him that they might touch, if it were but the border of his garment. And as many as touched him were made whole. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. This final reading from chapter 6 of Mark has a narrative which is very condensed, and so we in a way need to try to infer what's going on in between the verses. From the last reading, the previous reading, we have the famous miracle of feeding the 5,000. And we can only imagine the scene where you have thousands and thousands of people gathered, being taught by this, as far as they're concerned, holy prophet, and then essentially being part of a miracle of being fed from 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And in other Gospels, as we'll see as we go through the Gospel year, we get a bit more insight into the excitement that caused amongst the multitude that was gathered there in that remote place. I think for the people that witnessed that very overt miracle, they essentially wanted to announce Jesus as some great leader, some great king. And as we've talked about in earlier readings from Mark, Jesus went to great pains to have a ministry of compassion, mercy, and healing, bringing people to God through witnessing good acts, not through being a powerful figure that somehow then demanded to be worshipped. And I think what we see here is that Jesus was probably very uncomfortable with the fervour in that multitude, and he essentially dealt with it by first of all getting his disciples away from the scene, so asking them to enter the ship and to go across the Sea of Galilee, and basically dispersing the people by himself with holy authority. And we then read that he departs into a mountain to pray. Again, this theme of Jesus showing us the incredible importance of prayer, but also the fact that Jesus generally prayed in solitude. And indeed, as we'll see as we go through the gospel year, when he talked to his disciples about prayer, he advised that they pray also in solitude. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 happened towards the end of the day, and now evening has come. Jesus is alone, high up, probably looking over across the Sea of Galilee, and he can see the ship with the disciples. Probably, one can imagine it's a mile or two away, but he can see that it's not making much headway. There's a contrary wind, and they can't use the sails, so they're rowing, but they're not making much progress. And we have a famous miracle of Jesus walking on water, walking upon the sea in the middle of the night. He cometh unto them, walking upon the sea. Again, a nice little touch here. There's this little phrase, and would have passed by them. So it's almost like he's being quite nonchalant, but they see him and of course are astounded. They don't believe it's Jesus of Nazareth. They believe it's a spirit. And they're afraid and they cry out. And he reassures them. Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid. And then he enters into the ship. As we saw before, when Jesus commanded the wind and the sea to be calm, here, just by entering the ship, the wind ceases, almost as if it remembers. When Jesus Christ is in a ship, I have to stop blowing, at least not blowing so hard. And the disciples are beyond amazed. In the Old English, sore amazed in themselves beyond measure. Lovely, lovely old phrase there. And it's interesting, so amazed because it wasn't enough that Jesus could feed the 5,000 from 5 loaves of bread. That was somehow, we've seen that, we've done that, that's okay. But now he's walking on the sea, and this is, truly amazing. And so this idea of their heart being hardened by witnessing miracles. And that's very true of us as human beings. We adapt to new environments very, very quickly so that we don't really appreciate the environments. In the modern age, it's akin to this beautiful phrase, technology is everything invented after you're born. So for people of my generation, so I'm a middle-aged person, we don't see the television as a sort of marvelous technology, but we do see the mobile phone as marvelous technology. Whereas to a child of 10, both the television and the mobile phone are just things that are around, like a tin opener. They're just things that people have and use. And there'll be new technology invented in 10 or 20 years' time that those children now, as 20 or 30-somethings, will regard as amazing, but their children will not. So the, in quotation marks, miracles of technology are very much akin to these miracles of Jesus Christ, in the sense that the witnesses become very used to it very quickly, and their heart is hardened, as it were. They pass over the Sea of Galilee into a region called Gennesaret, and here we have a very brief description of just tremendous excitement. Again, people will have heard of the great prophet Jesus of Nazareth, as he would have been thought of in those times, and throughout Galilee, and his ship would have been spotted, and the whole region round about, bringing the sick in beds to wherever he was. And this really is just a scene of intense healing. He went into villages or cities in that region, or just in the countryside, and the sick were laid in the streets and just wanted to touch the border of his garment. So that enormous act of faith they were sure that if they could just touch the border of his garment, they would be made whole. Very reminiscent of the miracle of the healing of the woman in the crowd with the issue of blood, we remember, when Jesus was en route to the home of Jairus to tend to his very sick daughter. And this brings us to the end of chapter 6 of Mark. It's a long chapter, and we have witnessed a number of miracles in this chapter, and I just wanted to try to say a few words as a scientist and a Christian about the nature of miracles. It's a topic I'll have to come back to many times, I think, but just to try and provide some context. A scientist who's an atheist will regard all of this as fantasy, like a child's fairy tale, and they will think that anyone, particularly with a scientific training, who believes in these stories as being simple-minded. And if you have that kind of faith, because that's a different kind of faith, so if you believe that the science that we know now is the only truth, then of course you cannot admit into your view of the world the miracles of Jesus, nor many other things that don't fit into that very well-defined set of knowledge that we currently have that we called, modern science. But two very easy points to make are, firstly, the science that we know now will change in the future. So in 100 years, we will have a different understanding of physics, we'll have a different understanding of biology, we'll have a very different understanding of psychology and neuroscience, because the brain is by far the greatest frontier ahead of us that we have very little knowledge of as scientists. So first then, the science that we know now is not the science, it's just science of the early 21st century and does not define a reality, it's just a representation of reality that will change into the future. And then the second point is one I've made before, which is that science can only inform certain questions in our lives. It's not something that can be applied to every circumstance. And that's because, strictly speaking, scientific knowledge arises from a process of experimentation. If you can't perform experiments, you cannot essentially do science. You can do forms of science based on observation, but it's much weaker. Strong science relies on experimentation, and experiments are hard to do. So in the absence of repeatable observations or better well-defined objective experiments, you cannot generate new scientific knowledge. But you see, the difficulty then is that there are many things in our lives that don't fit into those categories. They're not repeatable observations and they're not experiments, and it's very hard for science to speak about those things. And therefore, many questions just in everyday life are not actually addressable by science. That's not to say, though, that we shouldn't be able to make some statements regarding these miracles, not to say that they are scientifically plausible, but just to make some statements about the context of them. And what I would say is that if you look at, let's just take 3 different miracles. Let's take walking upon the sea, let's take feeding the 5,000, and let's take, say, healing, say the man with the withered hand in the synagogue. It's interesting, you could ask a scientist and you could ask a non-scientist which of those miracles is the least or most plausible from a scientific point of view. It's actually quite an interesting question. I don't think the answer is obvious, but what I can tell you is this, that the walking upon the sea is a miracle from a scientific point of view that requires essentially manipulation of electromagnetism. The reason that we can't walk on water as mortal human beings is that we're under the force of gravity, and the surface of the sea is not rigid enough to support our weight. But the ground is rigid enough to support our weight. So if an entity can control the electromagnetic interaction between themselves and the surface of water, essentially making it more rigid underneath them, then they'll be able to walk on it, essentially. So that's an electromagnetic kind of phenomenon. The healing, say, of a limb is really an aim of modern biology, regenerative medicine it's called, and people talk about using stem cells to try and regenerate tissues. And there are organisms like newts, the amphibian newts, who can regenerate limbs very easily. So I would not personally do this, but some scientists feel comfortable removing the limb of a newt or even the eye of a newt. And believe it or not, the limb and the eye will regenerate perfectly well. And that's because in those organisms, the tissue that's damaged has enough what's called developmental potential that it can actually essentially regrow itself. Remember that every part of our body had to grow once upon a time because we originate from a fertilized egg. So our cells sort of have the programs to make things. It's just that those programs are turned off in us. But in newts, some of them are not turned off, and that's why they can regrow a limb or regrow an eye. So the miracle of, say, healing a withered arm is actually a miracle of changing the developmental programming of cells. So that's something that science claims to be able to do. So that's in a way quite a plausible, much more plausible than it might seem at first sight. Interestingly, I think from the physicist's point of view, it's the feeding of the 5,000 where that's harder to put into a scientific context, because that's the creation of matter. And physicists are very fond of their conservation laws. So we have conservation of momentum and conservation of energy. And so the creation of matter is something that is definitely not an electromagnetic phenomenon. That would be a nuclear phenomenon. So essentially, that would involve turning energy into matter, as we know from the one physics equation that everybody knows is from Einstein, E equals mc squared. So energy and mass are equivalent, as Einstein showed from special relativity. And so the creation of new matter is actually essentially a nuclear phenomenon using that mass energy equivalence. So I'm definitely not trying here to explain the miracles through our current understanding of science. I'm simply trying to give you an insight into what kinds of science would we have to think about in order to critique the miracles and place them into some kind of context within a scientific body of knowledge. But as a scientist and a Christian, I don't spend much time trying to explain the miracles of the Gospels using our current knowledge of science for the reasons that I've gone through a few minutes ago. But we'll keep coming back to this because I think it is an interesting topic, and if I get feedback through the YouTube videos about this topic, I can go into more details as well. So we've reached the end of chapter 6 of Mark, and we'll be seeing more of the Pharisees in the coming chapter.